Hi, everyone. It's good to be back again. Happy Monday. Um, if you can hear me, please give me a thumbs up or a comment. I'm broadcasting just from my laptop today, so I don't have my usual setup in my microphone. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about food reinforcers today, what to think about when you're choosing whether or not to use food, what kind of food to use, and then we did a little survey in our Facebook group, and I'll share the results with you where people told us what their favorites are for training. All right, so why are we going to spend time talking about reinforcers? Just as a reminder, we're talking about positive reinforcement today. And the definition of positive reinforcement, or a definition, is something that when gained following a behavior increases or maintains the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future in similar contexts. So you ask your dog to sit, you give them a treat. The likelihood of them sitting when you give the sit cue in the future, hopefully, will increase. Oh, if you have any questions during today's broadcast, please just put them under the video where you're watching this, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. All right, there are lots of ways to classify reinforcers, but two sort of broad categories are conditioned and unconditioned. Unconditioned is what we're talking about today because we're talking about food, which means unconditioned means something that is a reinforcer kind of naturally or on first exposure to an animal, and conditioned means that the reinforcing sort of properties or function of the item is something that's been learned. So those of you who are using things like clickers or marker words, those things might have become conditioned reinforcers for your dog. Oops. 1 second. There we go. All right. So many ways we use reinforcers to teach brand new behaviors. We all do that. Improve the performance of a behavior your dog is already doing, but you want to make it better, change some parameters of it. You need reinforcement to maintain existing behavior. Remember, that's why we can't just totally stop reinforcing something after the dog initially learns it, because something has to reinforce the behavior or it will die. And we can also use reinforcers to teach a dog when or where to do different behaviors. So usually, differentially reinforcing certain behaviors in certain contexts. When you're thinking about what to use for reinforcement in your training, there are a lot of things to think about. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but some things to think about are, one, does it fit your training context? And by training context, that could mean both sort of where you're going to do your initial training and also where you need the behavior training to work at the end of training. Like, what real life context are you going to use this behavior in? Are there any health effects of the reinforcer that might, limit how much you can use? Cost is kind of self-explanatory. Convenience to you for using that reinforcer. Whether or not your dog quickly gets tired of any particular reinforcer. If you're just doing one-off kind of training trials or not doing too many in a day, this might not matter too much. But if you're doing sort of higher volume training, doing lots of repetitions, then you're probably not going to want to use a reinforcer that your dog kind of gets tired of or satiates on quickly. And dogs vary a lot on what reinforcers they get bored of quickly. Does it facilitate or disrupt training? So does it actually help your process, or does it kind of get in the way and make things a little harder? And of course, can you control access? So if you're going to use something as a reinforcer, you need to be able to manipulate its availability so you can make it available contingent on or after the behavior that you're trying to train. All right. Now, why are we talking about food reinforcers? Well, if you're training using positive reinforcement, you probably use food a lot already. It's probably the most common reinforcer type used in dog training and positive reinforcement dog training. Um, and there are lots of reasons for that. It's very easy to use. It's easy to carry with you, to have ready on hand. You can quickly deliver it. Um, Food is reinforcing, really, I guess, unless they're dying, for pretty much all dogs, at least in some context. And for most dogs, um, you can find ways to use food in training, and it can work as a reinforcer in many different contexts. And there are a lot of dogs who seem to never tire of food, so they don't satiate, they don't stop working for food. Presumably they would eventually, but there are plenty of dogs that it doesn't seem to matter how much they've already had to eat, they're still happy to eat. Now, of course, like with any reinforcer type, there are going to be some potential downsides as well. If you have a dog who is overweight and you're trying to trim their calories, then training with food might have some limitations for you. You have to watch how much you give them. Food is very often not the naturally occurring reinforcer for a lot of behaviors that dogs do, which, isn't the end of the world, but it does mean that unless you transfer control of the behavior to a natural reinforcer, so you kind of eventually fade in or add in some reinforcers that the dog will just naturally contact in the environment for the behavior you're training, you're going to need to continue to support that behavior using food long term. So, you may have no problem with that. I don't have any problem with using food long term to reinforce behaviors that don't really have any other real handy or quote unquote natural reinforcers for them in the environment, but it's just something to keep in mind. Food, and this can be true of any reinforcer really, but food sometimes elicits unwanted behaviors when you're in training. If any of you have dogs or have worked with dogs who are like really food crazy, which is not a real behavioral term, but they're really into food. You may have dogs that do behaviors in the course of training that are not things you want, like jumping up toward your hand to try to get treats, orienting toward your hand or toward your treat bag when you need them to not do that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that you can't use food, but you may have to make some adjustments to your training. And it's possible that in some cases there are other reinforcers that would work better for that training. And finally, food can, and this is true for people too, can kind of supersede or swamp out the importance sort of or interest in other reinforcers in the environment. So I've seen this, one of the first things that comes to mind for this kind of thing is when we're doing dog introductions on leash and we're using food to reinforce whatever, behaviors we'd like to see, say on leash around other dogs, like attention to mom, walking nicely on leash. But for some dogs, if they're so interested in food that their interest in greeting or sniffing another dog is kind of backburnered. And so in order to get them to interact with the other dog, we need to stop reinforcing with food for a while, maybe hide the food. So that can be another issue. It can your dog can just focus on the food and not attend to other things that you might want them to pay attention to in the environment. Now, sometimes that's good, right? Those of you with reactive dogs are like, I love that my dog will focus on food over triggers. And there's nothing wrong with that. All right, so here are those considerations for positive reinforcement. And I wanted to go through them briefly, talking about them in the context of using food as your positive reinforcer. So, does it fit your training context? Does it affect health? Is it cost effective? How convenient is it? Does your dog get tired of it easily? Does it facilitate or disrupt your training? And can you control it? Okay, so does it fit your training context? What might that mean when we're talking about food reinforcers and dog training? Um, well, some of you work or spend time in places with your dog where food isn't allowed. There are a decent number of dog parks that will have signs on the outside that says no treats. Or if you're in some kinds of competitive pursuits with your dogs, like dog sports, sometimes food isn't allowed in those contexts either. So obviously, if you can't use food in the context you need to train in, then this, it's probably shouldn't be your top choice. Is the activity that you're asking your dog to do, the behavior, compatible with eating? So if you're training, say, um, some kind of active behavior, and like your dog's running around or jumping or whatever, and you give them a treat, and then they choke on it because they're running, that might again be a reason not to use food, or at least not some kinds of food. Can you use it long term? So this goes back to the question of whether or not food is the sort of naturally occurring reinforcer for behavior in a given context. Um, are you okay, and is it plausible for you to just continue to support whatever behavior you're training with food reinforcers kind of forever? If not, then you might want to think about starting even training, if possible, possibly starting training with different reinforcers that you can use long term. All right, health effects. Probably a lot of you are familiar with these. Obviously, calories can be a concern, especially for dogs that are either already overweight or even just small dogs. They fill up so quickly. Fat and sodium in a lot of, especially prepared treats. And if you have a dog with any kind of dietary restriction or food allergy, that really cuts down on the food reinforcers available to you. Cost is pretty self-explanatory. Some of the commercial dog treats can really add up. They're really pretty pricey. How convenient is it for you? How much prep time? Do you have to cut it up? Is it something you have to cook? Is it perishable? So that means you can't forget and leave your treat bag in the car or leave it out somewhere. It always has to go back in the fridge. Does your dog quickly get tired of it? And again, this is something you probably just get to know with your individual dog. Like, they'll do the first several reps for, I don't know, some kind of treat or something. But then after the first 15 minutes or so, they're kind of like, they stop responding as reliably to cues. They don't seem as interested in the food. So you're going to, if you are using food, you're going to want to look for foods that your dog doesn't get tired of so quickly, or use a greater variety, which we'll talk about maybe in a couple weeks. Does food disrupt your training? And there are a few ways that can happen, and I bet most of you have experienced this at one time or another. One is if you're trying to train quickly, like go through a lot of repetitions in a short time, and if you can imagine something like you're training with peanut butter, and you give your dog a little lick of peanut butter, and 5 minutes later they're still sticking their tongue out over and over again trying to lick the peanut butter off the roof of their mouth, and you haven't been able to do another repetition. So there are some foods that can slow you down, or like a big crunchy treat that takes your dog forever to chew and you're just waiting for them to finish. Those are some ways that food could slow down your training depending on the foods you're using. Also, food can sometimes, and any reinforcer really, might interfere with what you're teaching. I mentioned earlier, if the dog is just orienting to the food when you need them to orient elsewhere, or trying to get the food out of your hand, or doing other behaviors that are not helpful sort of won't help you achieve your training goals. It doesn't mean that you can't use food. Of course, you can train them. You can train a dog not to jump on your hand, and that and they need to look away from the food. But that just means there will be some extra training involved. Or, for instance, if you are training an active behavior, and when you give your dog a treat, they stop moving and stand to chew, or grab a treat and move away somewhere to eat it, which some dogs do, that might also interfere with your training. All right, and can you control access? For most of us, we can control our dog's food access pretty well. So this usually isn't a concern. All right, let's get to our survey results. So we asked our Facebook group, which is facebook.com/dogkindsupport. And I brought to you the top, well, we divided it into two categories, or I divided the results into two categories: human food and then, commercial dog treats. And I give you the 3 top human foods, quote unquote. Of course, it's all just food, but string cheese, I believe, was the top training treat that wasn't a commercial dog treat. Chicken breast, boiled, usually, was very popular. And then harder cheeses, which we didn't break it out, but probably things like Parmesan, where you can do little pieces. And then in terms of dog treats, the top 2 commercial dog treats that had the most votes, one was just freeze-dried beef liver. That was actually the #1 training treat over everything in the survey. And then Ziwi Peak, which we'll talk about more in a second. But there are, I have to remove that logo so you guys can see the link there. But I did add those this morning to our recommended products page. I included some links for freeze-dried liver and also a couple of Ziwi Peak products that I like. So here's a quick rundown of the pros and cons of our top 5 winners from our treat survey in the Facebook group. For each one, I just wanted to do a quick table so you can quickly look. And this is my opinion, by the way. Some of you may not think some things are easy prep or difficult prep compared to my opinion, but whether or not the food is quick for the dog to eat, so won't slow down your training, won't stretch out the time between repetitions. Is it easy for us, the human, to handle? Is it quote unquote healthy? And how much effort is it to prepare? Is it easy, or do you have to do some work? So pretty much all of these are pretty quick to eat. All of these treats, you can they can all be given in small quantities, small pieces, small enough that a lot of dogs won't even chew it. They just swallow it. In terms of ease of handling, personally, I find string cheese easy, and hard cheese is easy. Boiled chicken, I just wrote slimy, but basically your hands will get, chickeny. And so I find it not as nice to handle as some other treats. Freeze-dried liver, I also don't love to handle because it's really crumbly and can crumble just into a dust. And then if you're hand feeding, you can end up with this gross, like, liver paste on your fingers from sort of the dust mixed with your dog's saliva. So not my favorite personally. Unless if you were tossing it on the ground, it'd be better. Ziwi Peak, at least the stuff that I have used, is really easy to handle. It's not crumbly and it's not slimy or anything. Health-wise, boiled chicken, presumably pretty healthy, and liver and Ziwi Peak are probably pretty healthy too. The cheeses, they probably have a bit more fat and sodium than are ideal for our dogs. Preparation, string cheese is super easy. Just the only note is that you should have the little plastic wrapper open before you head out or go to your training session, because if you're in a hurry suddenly to get a reinforcer to your dog and the cheese isn't open, well, when you're in a hurry, it seems almost impossible to open the string cheese. So just have the package open beforehand. Boiled chicken, I don't think is particularly easy to prep. You have to buy chicken, possibly defrost it, cook it, cut it up. I'm pretty lazy about treat prep, so for me that's plenty. That's too much work, really. So I would not call that easy prep. Hard cheeses, It's not that difficult, but it's still more work preparing it than some other things because you do have to cut it up. And there's a lot of salt in the hard cheeses, so I usually try to cut it into really teeny pieces, which is a fair amount of work. Beef liver comes in cubes already, so just get it out of the bag and you're good to go. Very easy. And same thing with Ziwi Peak, it's already in pieces. I made a note here that I really prefer the air dried dog food preparations from Ziwi Peak. They also have freeze dried, but those tend to have the same issues as freeze dried beef liver. It's really crumbly, you get a bunch of dust, and it just makes a bit of a mess. All right, folks. So that is it today for talking about food reinforcers. If you're looking for just straight up variety, you weren't interested in just the top selections from our group, go on over to the Facebook group and look at that post. It's pinned at the top right now. Because it's the second link, the second Facebook link here on this slide, the dog kind support one. There are plenty of suggestions there, lots of different ideas, different brands. I just focused on the most popular ones this week. Places to find us online. We have our blog, Instagram, YouTube channel, and then at the bottom here, we have a somewhat new page on our website, dogkindtraining.com/free-resources, where we've sort of compiled all of our free stuff. So our free PDFs, our free webinars, link to the blog, link to the YouTube channel. So that can be a nice place to start if you're looking for more information. All right, everyone. Next week will be fun. We're going to talk about non-food reinforcers. Until then, have a lovely week, and I'll see you next time.